with Project Cobro, my personal 2003 Mustang Cobra, which I purchased, which is crazy, over 20 years ago. July 1st, 2002 is when I picked this car up. It was originally black. This is my first Mustang ever and the beginning of it all. All right, so I'm gonna give you a little bit of brief history about this car, the transformation, and where it is today. I've got it pretty much all buttoned up. There's a couple small things that I like to do to it, but for the most part, she's done. I remember picking the car up from the dealership, and again, it was one of the first ones in the area. At this point, the mods just started coming out, I guess, and the place to be at that point to see what modifications were available for this car was to be on svtperformance.com, and that's where I went on to, and I saw people talk about supercharger pulleys and tuning. There were chips back then. These the handheld device stuff wasn't even out back then. It was all chips, exhaust systems, and you know, headers and all that stuff. And that was the beginning of like the Cobra era, at least for me. I got into modding this car, actually reached out to the guys over at JDM Engineering. They were the first ones back then who were doing this stuff. I remember hooking up with those guys and talking to them about all different parts I can get. I ordered up some headers. I got a smaller supercharger pulley. I got the cold air intake. I did the mid pipe on it, the catback exhaust, and I remember it being tuned locally. And again, one of the first ones out there being tuned. So definitely exciting for me, because it's my first Mustang. I got one of the first Cobras around. I'm cruising around on the streets with this brand new 6-speed Cobra, which was like the baddest car like out at that point. I was going to different car meets and you know, just drive around. And what's funny is early on, some of the like people who I am best friends with now are from this car early on. When I was just driving around in Boca Raton, I remember meeting Brian Kearney, one of my best friends, Brian Kearney. I met him at a gas station there, and he pulled up in his 97 Cobra behind mine, and he's like, hey man, oh, this is the first one I've seen in person. I've got one on order, like, oh, you mind if I take a look at it? And man, eventually, there you go. Brian and I have been friends for over 20 years now, and it's all through this car right here. So pretty awesome. Well, after like doing the supercharger pulley and all the tuning and stuff like that early on, and you know, messing around racing, I remember taking it to the drag strip. My first time at a drag strip, I launched the car. It was the first time ever. So nervous. Half shaft, boom, done. My friends had to push it off the track and had to wait for AAA Plus to come and flatbed this thing from Palm Beach International Raceway, which was Moroso back then, and take it back home and get it fixed under warranty. But and that was it. That was my experience with these cars. I wasn't a good drag racer. I had no involvement in the aftermarket performance industry at all. I was just a kid with his first Mustang doing my thing. Back then, when it was just tuned and had a pulley on it and stuff, and I first started drag racing it, I was not in this industry at all. And I remember there was a lack of the availability of people who were providing performance parts for these cars. And eventually, I decided to get into the business of selling auto parts. That's a whole other crazy story. It wasn't really meant to be at all, but we incorporated Lethal Performance Inc. in 2004, started selling parts in 2005 with our website, and this was my only experience with performance cars really at that point, or at least Mustangs in the Ford aftermarket. What a ride it's been, man. It's crazy. You think about you know, being in business for 17 years now almost, and this is the one thing that basically made it happen and has been there with me the entire time. I've had this car before I was married, before having 2 children and stuff, and this car has been here forever. So early on with the supercharger pulley upgrade, probably in the mid to upper 400 wheel horsepower range. I mean, the cars came factory with 390 horsepower at the engine, so making mid to upper 400s was like, man, you're making power. And then the Whipples came out, and then making 600 to 700 wheel horsepower became the norm. And this back in 2003, 2004, you know, this is like, things were advancing pretty quickly from a car that only made 390 horsepower at the engine. You know, back then you had a 700 wheel horsepower car, you're like the king of it all. And then eventually when we did the 4-liter Whipple on here, and I had a built motor in it, it was a Texit block that Al Pepito put together from Boss 330 Racing, as well as Chris Darn's heads and cams, and I had Ken Bionis tune it locally. I had to put like 30 pounds of boost with a 4-liter through this car to make about 879 wheel horsepower. And this before like E85 was even a thing, so I'm pretty sure I was just running pump gas with some additive or some race fuel in it. And again, that car, you know, the car made a ton of power. Making just under 900 wheel horsepower on a Cobra wasn't bad at all. And you know, eventually I decided to go with a solid axle in it, and then it just, you know, from there the car sat. It was pretty sad. That brings me to the point to where I had formed all these awesome relationships in this industry, and it was only about a year ago when Willie Lujan and my friends Alex Corella and Christy, who works for us here, they were all like, hey, you know, let's get this car cleaned up, let's get it running again, you know, bring it in, we'll freshen it up. And my idea, I guess at that point, once I started thinking about it, freshen up is like, let's redo this whole thing. And I know a lot of the Cobra guys hate the fact that I did swap this car, but for me, it's what I wanted to do. And the idea was, hey man, if we're gonna do it, let's do it all in. I'm going all in on this thing. Let's do a Gen 3 Coyote swap, 10-speed auto in there. Let's go with a big old Whipple, fuel system, headers, everything, and let's make this thing happen. So that was the beginning of Project Cobra. First things first, reached out to Willie Lujan Motorsports, because he's the guy who's gonna do all the work on it. He said, man, just bring me the car. Let's get it up and running, right? I'm gonna make, you know, a project for me and help you out and stuff. We do a lot of business with Willie, we refer a lot of business over there. He's built some sick cars. I mean, a lot of my South Florida racer friends, most of them are all built by Willie, so that's why Willie was gonna build the car. So we discussed what we want to do, and then again, I went ahead and started ordering some parts for it. First thing, order up a long block, as well as a 10R80. And the control pack from Ford Performance, right off of Ford Performance's site. We're a big distributor for them, so I just went on there, ordered up wholesale, had it shipped on in. The next thing was the Whipple Supercharger. I ended up reaching out to Dustin Whipple. Whipple Supercharger, another great partner of Lethal Performance and a very dear friend of mine. He's got this, you know, 3-liter out there, which is kicking ass, Gen 5, awesome intercooler setup on it, no heat soak, whatever. I went 860s with the gold member with the pre-production 3-liter. And Dustin's like, hey man, I got this 3.8 liter Gen 5 coming up. Why don't we do that? I'm like, hey, go ahead, send it, let's do it. So we did a custom painted Savannah blue powder coated Gen 5 3.8 liter supercharger that's on here, you'll see in a minute. And then coming up with that, it was basically the other supporting mods. What am I gonna do to support the power it's gonna make? Well, we're using a Division X triple pump fuel system with the 274 pumps from Marlboro. Those are the high pressure 465 liter per hour pumps. We've got a dual regulated system. Since it is a Gen 3, it has a DI and a port side regulator to regulate fuel. We've got a large Marge fuel filter on it, all Pergola lines for the feed and the return. And then that mated to the rails that come on the Whipple kit. Whipple actually, for the Gen 5 3.8 liter, they use a fuel rail that has a -8 bore to it as opposed to their earlier model -6AN. So now, for injectors, I knew the type of horsepower that I wanted to support, maybe 1,000, 1,100 at the wheels. So especially on E85, I reached out to my tuner, Lund Racing. He said, go with the ID 1300s. So we went with the injector dynamic 1300Xs, and that's what we put on here. Just again, why did I go with the 3.8 liter as opposed to the 3 liter? I had such great success with a 3 liter. It was just the fact that Dustin was like, hey, I'd love for you to try it out, do some testing for me, see how it does. And that's why I ended up going to 3.8 liter. Now the 3 liter is, you know, for most people, more than enough. Again, I went mid-8s with that 3 liter on a stock engine Coyote, Gen 3 Coyote motor with a 10-speed in it. So, you know, how much more do you need? I would say the 3.8 liter is more of a competition-based blower, but for my project, I decided to go with it. You know, stock motor right now, but eventually I may build it and may want to throw more boost at it, so I have the growing room with that 3.8 liter. There's a lot of other things that are needed to actually do the swap, a Coyote swap in a New Edge Mustang. And that's where I reached out to Jake over at Power by the Hour Performance, who is basically like the god of Coyote swap stuff. He's been doing this stuff for so long. I mean, he was basically building cars for a long time. He's built several of our cars and got into this Coyote swap stuff, building parts, building brackets, everything to make the conversion work for every different setup, whether you're running a Whipple or a different type of a blower or a turbo kit or something like that. Jake has worked on making those parts available to people to do a Coyote swap. So Jake basically helped me out quite a bit, not only with the Coyote swap parts that I needed to make it happen, but also made a lot of recommendations on other things that I would need to make it work. So besides having that stock long block from Ford Performance, which I ordered up, and their control pack and 10R80, there are a couple other things that I wanted to do to those components to help make sure that they would handle the power that I'm looking to support. And some of the most common things, which can be overlooked by a lot of people, things that you know, you figure out later on down the line, I figured let's do this stuff while putting this build together. Before the engine was actually in the car, let's do the boundary oil pump gears and crank sprocket. Before the 10R80 is in the car, let's have Jake over at Power Body Hour Performance install the Mcleod steel and friction kit on it, as well as the Circle D converter, which is very similar to the one we run in Project Goldmember, which will allow me to foot brake the car and launch at about 3,600 RPMs and get my 60-foot times down and get a good run. And this, again, was to prevent possible engine failure from a broken crank sprocket or oil pump gear, as well as me burning up the clutches in a stock 10R80 when I'm trying to run it at the track and go 8s with it. So those are some things that are very important, and again, I'm glad that I did from the beginning rather than putting everything together and having to go back and do it again. I don't want to have to cost myself an engine because I neglected to put in a really inexpensive set of oil pump gears and crank sprocket. It makes sense. It's cheap insurance to do stuff like that. So, and again, the transmission as well. Why take it to the track with the stock transmission when we know at these power levels that the transmission, the clutches can slip on it? Since this is like such a unique combination, there's not like tons of people out there running this you know, Gen 3 Coyote 10-speed in a Cobra chassis, in addition to the headers like I mentioned and the K-member and stuff to make it fit. Also, we needed an aftermarket drive shaft. So reach out, another awesome partner of ours, the Driveshaft Shop, Frank and Lee. We've been dealing with these guys forever, selling their parts, even from back in the Cobra days when they first announced like the first set of half shafts for the 0304 Cobra. We've been running and selling their products forever. Great guys. I reached out to them like, hey, I need a drive shaft for Project Cobro. Lee's like, no problem, get me some measurements. Willie got the measurements done. Not too long after that, I got a beautiful carbon fiber drive shaft from the Driveshaft Shop, which we installed, fit perfect, and it's there to support the power. All right, so making our way to the rear of the car, talk a little bit about the drivetrain, you know, in the rear here. I had swapped out the IRS many years ago for a solid axle, which I actually got from Jake over at Power Body Hour Performance. I believe it might have been out of like a 97 Cobra or something like that. You know, when I brought it down to Willie, we looked at it, we're like, hey, let's take it apart, freshen it up, see what we got to do to it. We ended up ordering some Moser axles. I ended up putting a Eaton True Track in here. I've got a TA Performance diff cover on there, as well as some like Ford Performance gear install kit. And that was basically to beef up this rear end from where it was. In fact, when I ended up getting the Cobro brakes from Bear Brakes, we realized that the axles that were currently on my solid axle back here wouldn't fit properly, so that's when I really did have to look into getting axles, and that's why we went with Moser. Speaking about Bear Brakes, what was I gonna do for brakes on this car? Well, I reached out to Bear Brakes. My man Ricky Lund, we've been dealing with them for a very long time, another awesome partner, Elite Performance. Told him what we're looking to do. He suggested I go with the 6-piston, the 6Ps in a Pro Plus kits. I've got 14-inch rotors in the front, and I've got 13-inch rotors in the rear. And those guys made me custom calipers, black painted, Cobro engraved with the Savannah blue or grabber blue color inside of them. They look awesome, so that's what I went with for the brakes, and they look amazing. Let's talk a little bit about suspension. UPR Products, another awesome partner of ours, right down the road in Lake Worth. Really good friends with them, been selling their products for many years. That's who I chose to run the suspension with, so I reached out to those guys, told them what I was looking to do, and those are the guys who spec'd out everything for me, from the K-member, the A-arms, I've got the anti-roll bar on here, their upper and lower control arms, pretty much everything UPR. And again, there's a lot to the UPR suspension stuff that I'm really not super familiar with, so definitely stay tuned for another video where I'm going to be taking Project Cobro down to UPR Products in Lake Worth, and Steve, the catch cam man, is going to go over every single component in detail, so we'll have that lined out for you guys for anyone who has questions about the suspension setup. Now, I do know besides all the UPR suspension stuff on here, the other stuff I'm running is from Viking Performance. I'm running the double adjustable Crusader coilovers in both the front and the rear, so when I go over to UPR Products and talk about the suspension, I'll have Steve go over that stuff in a little more detail as well, so you guys can find out more information about the Viking products on this car. The exhaust system that I previously had on this car was some long tube headers, went to an off-road mid-pipe, and then a Magnapack catback. And I'll tell you something, 2.5-inch Magnapack with headers and you know, off-road setup, it was extremely loud, and I did not want to go with that setup again. So being that the long tube headers from Ultimate Headers on this car, they're only sold as a header, there's no matching mid-pipe or anything like that because people put them in so many different chassis and have to build custom exhaust around it. I did have to have some custom exhaust from the collectors all the way back. That's where I chose our friends over at Miami Muffler, my man Miguel. Been doing business with him for a long time. Lujan Motorsports, put it on a trailer, brought it over to Miguel over at Miami Muffler, and they did the whole custom exhaust setup. It was a 3-inch off-road stainless steel X-pipe going to a 3-inch catback system using Jones's mufflers. I had actually never heard of Jones mufflers, but it sounds awesome. And we did also use some stainless V-band clamps to actually set up these tailpipes so they're removable. And I took them out, had them powder coated black so they match my whole black and grabber blue theme here. All right, so you guys want to pop the hood and take a look?
Sir, yes, sir.
Let's do it. Being the fact that the Gen 5 3.8 liter is wicked efficient to begin with, there wasn't really much aftermarket cooling stuff that we had to do with it. I don't have a trunk mount intercooler tank or anything like that, but I did need to install a front mount heat exchanger on this car. And so I ended up getting a very special gift from Justin over at J2 Fabrication. He made me a one-off Cobro engraved intercooler on here. This thing is massive up front. That's going to help with any cooling problems that I might have, although I really don't see having any issues with the Gen 5 3.8 liter, but you know, making it better and more efficient is always something to think about when you're doing a project like this. So I was glad to put that intercooler on from Justin. Thank you very much. Here inside the engine bay, I've got 2 tanks, one of which is the Lethal Performance intercooler reservoir tank for larger capacity, powder coated black, and also over here is our powder coated black coolant reservoir tank. Now, we actually had to modify this, being that the Whipple 3.8 liter as well as their 3 liter for the Coyote is a front feed supercharger. This intake comes out here and interfered with the tank, so Willie actually modified this, had it welded up, and then repowder coated black, and now everything fits great. Grip Tech, thanks Drew for hooking it up. I've got their 3.625 upper supercharger pulley in an 8 rib, and I'm also running the stock size balancer. It's actually an aftermarket balancer from ATI, which comes included in the Whipple 10 rib kit, but since Jake at Power by the Hour Performance doesn't have the stuff for the Coyote swap to be able to run a 10 rib, I am running an 8 rib setup on here with that ATI balancer lower and the Grip Tech upper, slated to make about 22 pounds of boost. Also, you can see inside the engine bay here, there's a couple other real nice goodies from UPR products. Steve, the catch can man, went over to Willie's, got this car all set up with their catch can set up with the CSS over here. So any oil mist from running the high boost that would normally recirculate back into that throttle body through the intercooler and then into the combustion chamber is captured in that can, which actually I can drain anytime I like and then check my oil level and refill it. But having that catch can on there is a real nice thing. We've also got their Shark caster camber plates, which are designed to work with the coilover setup that I have on here, and I'll have Steve explain that a little more when I bring this down to UPR products. So we got this badass Cobro build, right? Gen 3 Coyote, 10-speed auto, Whipple Superchargers, fuel system, suspension, everything else. What else do we need to put it all together? A custom tune. That's why I reached out to Lund Racing. These guys have been tuning for us since 2009. We are their largest dealer, period. And those guys do a phenomenal job. So I asked them to tune my Cobra project. So the tuning process was actually very simple with Lund Racing. All they asked was the information off of the PCM from the control pack from Ford Performance, as well as a serial number off of an N-Gauge, which I'm using for this car. And using HP Tuner software, they whipped up a base file. Willie did some idle logs as well as some part throttle logs for these guys to review, make sure all the fuel trims, everything looks good, and everything was perfect. So it was off to the dyno. Dyno day was the last video. When I went down to pick up the car, Willie had the car brought over to the dyno right next to him, had it strapped down, which is a dyno jet. It must have been at least 95 degrees and humid as can be. That's typical Florida weather for you in the summer. So I wasn't really expecting the best results from the dyno, but I know that the tuning on it would be done right, everything would be where it should be, so when it does cool down, the car would make even more power. So we had it strapped down, we made a couple pulls to about 5,000 RPMs, send an email off to Lund Racing for for John Jr. to review the logs. He said everything looked good, so we let it rip. I believe we pulled this thing up to about 8,500 RPMs, and it showed about 22 max PSI boost on the mechanical gauge that we're using, and it made 972 wheel horsepower. For me, that's a lot of power. I think for most people that's a lot of power, especially in a car I believe is pretty light, at least lighter than Project Goldmember. So I know this car is going to move out when I get it to the track. So definitely, if you want to see more information about the dyno video, what it did on the dyno, make sure to check out the previous episode. But again, I can't thank Lund Racing enough. Those guys did such an awesome job, and Willie working with them, such an easy process, emailing back and forth data logs, asking questions, making changes, and the car doesn't need to be on the dyno all day long. This stuff is already done basically before it gets to the dyno, just a quick log or two while it's on the dyno, make sure everything looks perfect, and there you have it. So we're inside the car right now. There's really not much to it. It's a simple Cobra interior, and you can see I've got this nickel over here right in the trim around the radio to prevent the rattling, which is every Cobra knows the rattling from it. Basically, just want to talk a little bit about the gauges, because when I did the Coyote swap, you do have to change the gauge setup on it for it to read everything properly from the newer style PCM. There's a lot of data that the older cluster inside the Cobra won't read. So the VHX digital gauge cluster from Dakota is also what I got from Power by the Hour when I purchased all the other swap components, and it's installed here. It looks real nice, and obviously I've got my fuel level, I've got the coolant temp, I've got battery voltage, oil temperature, and everything is digital on it, and it plugs in through your OBD2 port. So there's still a bunch of stuff that I'm not familiar with about it. I've heard that these things are pretty tricky, so when I do go over to Power by the Hour Performance and talk to them in depth about the Coyote swap parts that we used on this car, we'll have Jake show us a little more about the digital gauge cluster from Dakota. Another thing that I want to talk about is doing these swaps is not easy, and taking your car, if you want to do a Coyote swap, to someone who's done them before is a very good idea. And that's why again I chose Willie Lujan of Lujan Motorsports, because he's done a bunch of Coyote swaps and has done a phenomenal job on them. He knows the ins and outs, the things that you come across, the hurdles that you got to overcome. And one of the big things I'll talk about was the actual transmission. Now, since it's that 10-speed auto in here and it locates the shifter in a different area, I wanted everything to look factory. I want to use this trim piece here. I want to have the factory boot here so it looked factory, and part of that was arranging and placing that shifter in the right spot. Now, we actually used the bottom of a 9904 automatic shifter and cut and welded on the top piece, the shifter lever with the shift select buttons on here from 11 to 14 automatic, and that's how we made it work. I gotta say thanks to Rob Little as well, because when I was looking into this project and talking about it, that's something he suggested to me, which I wasn't really familiar with. But we got the parts with the help from Willie sourcing some of these things, and he did the work where he cut the shifter, welded it on, got everything in place, and he placed this shifter exactly where I want it. It's perfect right there, and everything shifts perfectly. He also told me there were some things about having to put the transmission cable, basically the shifter cable, in the right location. You've got to measure everything, put a bracket in a certain spot. So again, talking about making sure you bring your car to someone who's experienced in doing a Coyote swap, very important. That's why I chose Willie Lujan at Lujan Motorsports. And last but not least, everyone likes their Cobra to look good on the street, have a nice set of wheels on there. That was my dilemma. What am I going to run? What better wheel to run on an 03 Cobra would be the CCW Classics. So I went with the 18x11s in the rear, and I went with the 18x9.5s in the front. I've got a gloss black barrel here. I've also got a satin black spokes and windows for it, and they came out real nice. Now, they're a lot wider than what I used to run on here, so I actually realized after picking the car up and hitting a few bumps on the road when I was gouging one of my tires that I need to have my fenders rolled. So I actually looked it up online, and I got some recommendations from a guy here in West Palm Beach to use a guy named Rob from Rob's Fender Rollers. He's on Instagram, go check him out. Great guy. I took this car actually over to him on a Sunday, and he did the work for me and rolled the fenders basically in the parking lot with all his gear, did a phenomenal job. So everything is rolled nicely, and now I don't have to worry about if I hit any bumps or anything like that, I'm gonna gouge any tires, and she's all set up and she looks great. Now, the car, for the most part, is done, except for a few things. I'm gonna have to do the tint on here. I've got 20-year-old tint, which is peeling, some interior work I wanna do, like sound system, maybe a backup camera, which would be nice. It's really convenient, you know, when you're driving newer cars and you have a backup camera and you hop into a Cobra and you realize to back up, there's no backup camera. So I'm gonna do an upgrade on the sound system and the nav and everything else. And then I will do a full paint correction and ceramic coat on here, and I think she'll be ready. Hope you enjoyed the walk around and the things that I did to my Cobro swap over here. And if you followed me from the beginning, all the Cobro series from beginning to end, you see it's been an awesome project and a lot of fun. Really grateful for a lot of the partners that have stepped up and worked with me on this. Again, Willie Lujan Motorsports, Whipple Superchargers, Mcleod, UPR Products, Viking, Ultimate Headers. All these guys done so much stuff to help me out with this project. CCW, Bear Brakes, all these guys are great people to deal with, and I'm so glad that we work with them on a daily basis here. So you guys are going to see a lot more from this car. Again, stay tuned, because I will be taking it down to UPR Products to have them talk a little bit about more of the suspension stuff as well as that catch can. And I will be taking the car over to Jake over at Power by the Hour to explain the Coyote swap kits, as well as that awesome new dash that I have in there, because it is running an aftermarket dash and I'm still learning about it. So we'll have Jake explain it to us in detail. So thank you guys so much for watching Project Cobro. Stay tuned for more. Please make sure to subscribe and like our videos. If you have any questions, please comment on the videos and we'll be more than happy to reply to you guys. Mustang King, Project Cobro, and I'm out. It all started out in 1964 when my grandfather, with my hands, Joe, or anything, it's my first time doing this.
You can just keep them at your side, Jared. You can just keep them down.
Okay, got it. All right. Yeah. Our friends over at Miami Muffler, my man Miguel, been doing business with him for a long time. Lujan Motorsports, Willie took the car on a trailer over to Willie. I wanted.
Pause. You said Willie took the trailer of the car over to Willie.
Oh, did he?
Yeah,
you sure? No, Miguel.
100%.
No, I said Willie to Miguel. Listen to it right now, Joe.
Willie took the car on a trailer over to Willie.